So I'll just speak from down here. Good morning on this very, very cold winter's day, and I know that some of you are probably wondering about the wintry conditions you might be flying back in soon. But hopefully we can all stay warm in here. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Mark Clague. He is actually one of the committee organizing members. I'm sure you know him well by this point. And his talk this morning is called The Imperative for Recording Black Music. Natalie Hindress, pianist, plays music by Black composers, 1971.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, all right. No, it's just a huge pleasure to be here, and one of the things I love about these kind of conferences that have this intimacy and the fact that we're all going to all the same sessions is that the papers start to speak to each other. So I think you'll find that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today was in some ways foreshadowed by what Kira talked about last night, and then also the panel on decolonizing the canon in the morning with Connor and Anna Maria and Leah and Dr. Toppin. So, but I want to talk about basically a recording that's been very important in my life, which is Natalie Hindress's 1970 release and it was titled Natalie Hindress Plays the Music of Black Americans, the piano music of Black Americans. But in the last few months, we've been spending time celebrating really another landmark achievement from about the same time, about 50 years ago, Dr. Eileen Southern's The Music of Black Americans. And this is the current edition of this book, if you've seen it. But as my colleague Charles Garrett said, this really remains a landmark achievement, and really in some ways the most sort of comprehensive examination of not only what happened with black musicians, but sort of the cultural importance of that, these issues of systemic racism, and just an amazing book. And one of the things that's incredible for me to think about is that in 1985, Eileen Southern was on this stage at a conference of black music that was organized by Willis Patterson here at the University of Michigan. And so there's just an amazing synergy between what we're doing here in 2022 and this work, which really goes back to these pioneering scholars. But as Kira mentioned yesterday, there's a footnote in the very back of this book where Eileen Southern laments the fact that there are so few recordings of music by black composers. And she's specifically speaking about black classical composers in this case, because she says, while there is an enormous discography for black music in the areas of folk, popular, and jazz music, the picture is bleak in regard to recordings of composed art music. Those terms, I think, have been interrogated a little since then, but the legacy and sort of the canon that Kira was talking about and the way in which classical music, and specifically German classical music, was put on this pedestal, created an extra barrier that black composers had to leap over to be accepted. So I think we can see this in the recorded history. And for that reason, for me, this recording by Natalie Hindress was sort of like the shot heard around the world. It was the moment where, at least for me as a young scholar, and I probably got to know this recording in the early 90s on a CD re-release by Composers Recording International, or Incorporated rather, and so not in this original LP release, but it was the power and commitment of her artistry that made me realize that this music would reward study. And it was really the recordings that spoke to me before the scores, before none of this was in textbooks really at the time. It was not in my classes, it was not in my graduate training, but it was these recordings that really sang to me. And there are 9 composers, 8 of whom were living but all of whom were connected to Hindress in some way. Nathaniel Dett, Thomas Kerr, William Grant Still, who, in many ways, at this time for me, was like the one composer who was really out there, because Judith Ann Still was really advocating for her father's music, was doing talks all around the country, was self-publishing and making the scores available. And it was, William Grant Still music was sort of the only game in town if you wanted to get any of this music, at least from a commercial publisher, for somebody you can call up, outside the archive. John Wesley Work III, George Walker, Arthur Cunningham, Talib Rasul Hakim, who was originally named Stephen Chambers, Hale Smith, and Ollie Wilson. Hindress herself, was a huge figure in her day, and I'm just sort of curious how many people had heard of her before. So this room's pretty good. As I've been telling people about this talk, people are like, who? I have no idea who this is. Part of it is she died from cancer right after she turned 60 years old. She was a professor at Temple University in Philadelphia and had a very prominent career. I mean, she was actually represented by Columbia artists in the 1940s and 50s. So the fact that there was this person out there who had such a prominent career. She did 2 State Department tours. She soloed with like Cleveland and Detroit and Philadelphia, just major symphonies all around the United States. And yet she's a figure that's pretty much forgotten, which surprises me, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to share her story a little bit with you today. One of the things, again, that speaks to Kira's talk is the importance of Oberlin Conservatory in our story of the early training of African American musicians. And her mother was on the piano faculty at Oberlin, and she was personally acquainted with like Nathaniel Dett, who would come to town. And George Walker was a fellow student when she was there. George Walker, the pianist. We'll also talk about a second George Walker on Broadway briefly. Different people, but I think this sort of the support and this community. And Kira hinted at this, the power of the social networks that produced, the sort of reinforcing of possibility of telling people they had talent and they could make things happen, that was in this community of black musicians in Oberlin, Ohio, I think is, it's literally, as we saw with Kira's talk, the implications of that radiated across the world and led to the very first black American woman who soloed with the Berlin Philharmonic. So that's pretty amazing. She graduated at age 17 with her bachelor in science in music, which I think is pretty cool, and then went to do graduate work in Philadelphia with Olga Samaroff and Edward Steuermann. Again, prominent career. She not only released this 1970 recording, but several others. She recorded George Walker's Piano Concerto that was written for her in 1976 with Paul Freeman and the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. And because of her recording, she got integrated into the kind of historians and sort of black music scholarly network that invited her here to Michigan, and before that to Indiana University, where Dominic René de Lerma was working. And he was the one who shared Joseph Ballone's Adagio in F minor with her, and then she recorded that, and then she also did the banjo as sort of an encore piece on a later recording from 1983, which has quite a few of sort of more standard repertory works on it, if you're interested in hearing her artistry there. So exploring Southern's call to sort of address this issue of recording music by classical black composers led me down a couple of rabbit holes. One was, well, were there any other recordings by black composers? And this is the question that came up yesterday in our session. And the first, I'll just go through a few of them. I'm going to go through them quickly just because it's, as I said, it turns out to be a rather surprisingly deep hole given how little we know and how absent these recordings are from our history. So the very first recording of a sort of classical piano work that I've been able to find is Nathaniel Dett's own recording from 1919 of 2 movements from his suites, one being the barcarolle from In the Bottoms, composed in 1913, and then the other being the movement Mammy, or Mother, from Magnolia Suite from the year before. And I thought it would just be fun to listen to a little bit of Dett playing. So really interesting, and it came up a little bit with Kira was talking about yesterday about performance practice. I mean, the lilt, the sort of groove that's in the underlying swaying motion there, and the rubato that Dett brings to his own music. Had anybody heard that recording before? Wow, cool. I have done my job. Whoops, sorry. Dett, of course, was born in Canada, so, I mean, technically, he's not an American composer, although his career was very much in the United States. So I went searching a little bit different, and in pretty much the same recording company, which is an unusual recording company, only existed for 1 year, the Broom Special Recording Company, also recorded the music of American violinist Clarence Cameron White. And this is his Lament, which was recorded that same year in 1919. There's a pianist accompanying White. His name is William Leonard King. I know nothing about William Leonard King. Haven't been able to find anything. But so if anybody knows anything about him, I assume he's African American because the Broom Special Recording Company was created to basically record the music of Roland Hayes. I mean, that's sort of what inspired the company or his performances. And then it made its mission to record other black artists, and then sort of morphed into the Black Swan Recording Company in New York in the early 20s. But this is actually the year before, 2 years before 1919. So pretty remarkable recording, in part because of the level of artistry, the sort of emotional intensity to the shaping of each note. As far as I can tell, this is sort of an original melody based on a sort of a spiritual style, but particularly remarkable considering that this is entirely acoustic recording techniques, right? You don't have the electric microphone until 1925. So all of the recordings that I'm playing in this early part of the talk are made entirely with those recording horns and that kind of setup. I mentioned this a little bit, but this is just quickly some history of the Broom Special Recording Company, which first recorded Harry T. Burleigh and Edward Boatner, who turns out to be George Shirley's first teacher. So that was pretty remarkable that there's there. And then this is Roland Hayes, who I forgot to put his name up there, but sort of inspired it, because Roland Hayes actually may be the first sort of classical black composer, or black performer rather, to record in the United States. But he did it by paying Columbia Records to record him himself. And so it was a personal private release and turned out to be financially untenable. And then that's what led to the connection to Broom, who was helping him promote his work, and then the brief existence of the Broom Special Recording Company. Looking even more deeply at, the question about what were the first black Americans to record at all, and not surprisingly, it's really from the popular sphere. So we talked a little bit about the possibility of piano rolls yesterday. Scott Joplin was recording 7 piano rolls in 1916, which could be, in a sense, sort of even earlier classical piano work by a black composer. But we have musicians from Black Broadway, in particular Williams and Walker, who are a famous team that are pictured here, as well as the very earliest recording, which surprised me how early it was, 1890, by a singer named George Johnson. So again, sort of in the popular sphere, focused in New York, and a lot of times even works by black composers were performed by white artists, because at least in early days of recording, it was not important who was singing just as much as the recording was of good quality. And because the recording technology was so quirky, you had to step away, certain dynamics, and really know how to use the recording horn. People specialized in those recordings, and they would imitate the voices of people like Williams and Walker. The very first recording I've been able to find of a classical work by a black composer is Samuel Coleridge Taylor's On Away, Awake, My Beloved, the tenor aria from his very popular at the time cantata Hiawatha's Wedding Feast. So this is a white tenor, Paul Althaus, singing for Victor Records in 1915. Samuel Coleridge Taylor wrote a lot of piano music, and is in many ways experiencing a kind of renaissance right now with the rediscovery of his orchestral works, bagatelles. I mean, there's just really fantastic music. He was relatively prominent in the United States, did a tour of the U.S., but died very young. So, again, his, music, one wonders what would have been done had he lived longer. The incredible thing for me as a musicologist is the implication of this recording. So the Victor Record Company actually put out a textbook, a music appreciation textbook written by Anne Shaw Faulkner Obendorfer in 1921. And it includes the very first reference to a composition by a black composer that's in a music history textbook that I've been able to find anyway. And actually, it's Melanie Zeck at the Library of Congress who alerted me to this. So she talks about Samuel Coleridge Taylor, along with Edward Elgar, being the prominent composers of England during that period. So, very much putting him as an equal alongside a canonical white composer, and very popular, certainly, in the early part of the 20th century in the United States. And then even more remarkable is the fact that his photograph was included in the textbook. And basically, it's another 50 years until this book that you really have this kind of inclusion. There are a few exceptions to this, and this is a rabbit hole that I haven't been able to fully go down, but there are references to other works by Det and then to Hiawatha Suite in a scattering of other books at the time. So I need to trace that down, but one of the references is to a work by Nathaniel Dett called Taxis, which I have not found anyone who can tell me anything about this piece. So if anybody knows anything about Taxis, let me know. We don't know if it refers to the automobiles or to taxi dancers or to something else, but it's repeated in several different books. So looking on that. If you may not recognize Anne Shaw Faulkner's name, but she was a prominent music education writer, largely for women's magazines, and famously wrote the article, Does Jazz Put the Sin in Syncopation?, which is largely panned as sort of this anti-black screed. This is one of the fun parts of history. So in her article, she praises country clubs, and it tells you a little bit who her audience was that she was writing for, who do three things. One is that they ban jazz orchestras, that they do not allow the young male and female dancers to leave the room during the dance, and also that they ban corset check rooms, which, you don't know if these things existed ever until you do your history. But interestingly, in this same article, she goes at great length to praise ragtime as what she calls the most important and characteristic American expressions to be found in our native music. So it's, interestingly enough, most of the jazz orchestras in 1921 would have been white bands, like Whiteman, right? But to an actual African-American musician writing solo piano music, and among other things, she's actually quite charitable and sort of recognizes this as authentic expression. So it's a complicated time, and I think one of the things that history also tells you is that the categories we have now of sort of being on one side or the other side of a contemporary issue don't necessarily fit our historical informants. Another important recording that is Levy Dance, also by Clarence Cameron White, which was recorded by the violin virtuoso Yasa Heifetz in 1945. And if you know this piece, has a central episode that has the spiritual go-down Moses in the middle of it. So this is a little bit of Heifetz, who played this piece in concert and recorded it in a prominent way. Oops, there we go. So there's just a handful of other recordings that I've been able to find. London Symphony Orchestra, maybe not surprisingly, Coleridge Taylor being Afro-British, recorded the Petite Suite to concert as well as the Hiawatha cantata. And then in 1952, a sort of a non-profit record company built to perform music of American culture recorded William Grant's, a whole disc of William Grant Still. And the front side was the Afro-American Symphony. And on the backside were 8 piano miniatures by William Grant Still. The pianist is a guy named Gordon Manley, who's Canadian. I don't know anything else about him. But he recorded, among other things, the 3 visions for piano, which is probably, historically, as we'll see, is the sort of one of the touchstones of the black piano repertoire. So this is a little bit of Dark Horseman. So in the interest of time, I'll keep moving. Let's see. So this brings us to Hinderas. And I think, her recording is really a kind of black arts pride manifesto, very important socially as well as artistically. And I don't want to throw Gordon Manley under the bus too badly, but let's compare his recording to Natalie Hinderas' recording of the same piece. And if you know this piece, the 3 visions is sort of a suite about death. And the Dark Horsemen are sort of the horsemen of the apocalypse, and there's an evil and an intensity to their presence, which for me comes across much more successfully in Hinderas' recording. So she didn't leave a lot of information about why she got into this project, but there's some circumstantial evidence. One is she joined the faculty at Temple University as an assistant professor in 1968. And then she received some support from the Afro-American Music Opportunities Foundation, which was a short-lived organization actually in Minnesota. And then I think, again, the connection to the Black Arts Movement should not be overlooked. But I wonder if this became, the fact that she had stable employment and she didn't have to be sort of out there working with the concert world as her only means of supporting herself, becoming a teacher with an institution. She had taught long before that, but not in a tenure track kind of position. And then, of course, the need to get tenure, right? The need to put something out original. And she knew all of these composers. I think that's a big part of it. But if we look at these 4 sides of these 2 LPs, there's sort of a clear kind of mapping. In the first disc, the A disc, has sort of neo-romantic works, things that are much more sort of expressive in terms, and sort of tone poem-like. Nathaniel, that's in the bottom. William Grant Street's 3 Visions. Shipranang is actually a reference to a river. And then a piece that doesn't quite fit this description, a more recent piece called Easter Monday Swagger, which is sort of I'll hopefully have time to play a little bit of it. It's an original spiritual that sort of goes through a set of variations. One of the pieces which I'd highly recommend people getting to know. And then disc 2 is more of a modernist disc. George Walker's Sonata No. 1, Arthur Cunningham's Engrams, Chambers Hakim's Sound Gone, which is one of my favorite pieces, Hale Smith Evocation, and Ollie Wilson's piece for piano and electronics. So part of the argument here sort of goes back to the Harlem Renaissance and sort of showing that African American music encapsulates a sincere humanity that can't be denied, right? That you can't deny people the rights of the vote of civil rights. And it's sort of encapsulated in music. And part of what the Harlem Renaissance did is write in sort of a neo-romantic style to be accessible, to get played by orchestras, and things like the Afro-American Symphony, William Levitt Lawson's Negro Folk Symphony, Florence Price's First and Third Symphonies got incredible play. I mean, they were done by the Philadelphia Orchestra, they were done by the Chicago Symphony, they were done by the New York Philharmonic, they were done by the Eastman Rochester Philharmonic. But this sort of modernist tradition, really from the 50s and 60s, is much more absent. It's not quite as audience-friendly, but was the sophisticated, most advanced musical language of its time. And these composers were participating in that discourse, right? In that work. Another amazing thing about this recording was what's on the cover of the booklet that's in it. And this is this sort of return to Black pride. And if you read Hinderis's interviews, and she did quite a few of them when this album came out, she talks about being in Oberlin and about the community and the fact that she was proud of this work. And she says, in a quote that really is powerful even today, "Our Black composers need no apology, no defense, no explanation, no patronizing. They need performance. They need to be programmed beside their fellow white composers from Bach to Berio." And then she quotes composer Hale Smith saying, "Place our music not on all Black programs, we can do that for ourselves, but for the benefit of our own people. Place our work on programs with Beethoven, Mozart, Schoenberg, Copland, and the current avant-gardists. We don't even have to be called Black. When we stand for our bows, that fact will become clear when it should, after the work has made its own impact." To this end, this album is dedicated. So, really powerful. I'm running out of time already. But these are some of the recordings from that piece. Let me just play just a tiny bit of Easter Monday Swagger, which I think is one of the most delightful pieces on the album. So this is sort of the original spiritual melody. And then in the interest of time, let me just skip ahead to some of the variations later. So really gorgeous, and then quite virtuosic. So sorry to cut that off. The other piece, which, I love a lot of these pieces, and John Ellis, if you're interested in the music of Arthur Cunningham, Arthur Cunningham was John's teacher, can tell you a lot about his music. Matthew Bankston, knows a lot about the music of George Walker, which I think, again, incredible pieces that really reward, deep study and engagement. 5 different sonatas. But this piece, Sound Gone, is one of the just absolute masterpieces on this album that people should really get to know more of. It's an interesting piece. It's a little bit Henry Cowell. It's a little bit African American spiritual. It's sort of this very sonic, impressionistic piece. But it's sort of hard to get to know. It's about 10 minutes long in just a brief excerpt. But let's just listen to the very beginning of it. killing me to have to stop. So just to summarize here, let's go on. There's a group of pianists who have sort of been inspired or followed in the footsteps of Hinderas, including Althea Waits, who released Black Diamonds in 1993, which is the first recording of the Florence Price Sonata, which we heard last night. And then Karen Wallman herself, who released 2 volumes of Dark Fires with all living composers in 2006 and 2007, composed her own music and released that, and then did the Florence Price reconstruction of the Concerto in One Movement in 2011. John Ellis recorded the music of Arthur Cunningham. There's many other things. But my challenge to you and to really to our students is to fill the remaining void. I mean, there are literally thousands of other piano works and keyboard works by Black composers. We'll hear about some of these from Kola in just a second. So there's lots to do. And I think Hinderas can be a model and an inspiration. And part of it is the level of artistic commitment that she brings to everything she does. I mean, these are just powerful recordings that argue that this is a music to be taken seriously. It's a music of deep humanity. And so the fact that she toured with this music, performed it at many colleges and in recital, she played it on her programs with sort of more canonical European works, having those works speak to one another because they were very much in conversation with canonical works. And then I would say the importance of doing video today, and here's Matt Bengston performing George Walker, but just to be able to be on YouTube to get stuff out. But you have to do it at a quality level that would make people engage and sort of think, be moved by this music. And I think it's also worth emphasizing the need to record these works multiple times. It's not just about doing the premiere, right? Because there's a depth of knowledge and engagement of sort of an archive of human experience that's there as performers engage with this music and bring their own humanity to that. And it's the multiple iterations deepen our understanding of that music. We do it, we would never say, oh, it's, that's the 300th recording of Brahms. Why would you record that again, right? But the same thing is true of George Walker or Florence Price. If you're looking for more stuff, there are tons of resources, including 2 entire books of, that are literally hundreds of pages long, with bibliography of piano music by Black composers. Aaron Horn's works are very not well known. He has volumes for string music by Black composers with string, brass, woodwind, and keyboard music. Helen Walker Hill did a whole volume of piano music by Black composers. There are online resources, including the African Diaspora Music Project, which Dr. Toppin mentioned yesterday, the LAMI project that Regulo and Maria have worked on, the composerdiversity.com project, and then human resources that are at this conference, including Connor, Che, Leah Claiborne, Ana Maria Otamendi, Matt, Tiffany, and then Kola, who's going to come up next.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was an extraordinary overview, and I think perhaps you could take some questions while we're setting up for the next talk.
Absolutely. My apologies for... There was too much to share. Yeah, Pamela.
It was so wonderful to hear these recordings. Thank you so much. It's really inspiring. As an improviser, when I hear Nathaniel Dove play and the violinist, what was his name? Clarence White. I hear improvisation in their playing. I wondered if there's any documentation of their improvisations, or whether they taught it, or whether they performed live improvisations in concert, or if that just might be a hidden underground in their practice.
Right. I haven't run across any discussion of Hinderas, for example, doing improvisation. She was definitely trained in a sort of a high Germanic tradition in Oberlin, so I think it was very much based on notated music. They're certainly in conversation with a sort of larger black musical tradition. You can hear that in like the Sunday morning swagger and things like that. But it's I think their particular training is very much focused on notated music, as far as I can tell. But a really good question. Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask one quick question?
Very, very quick.
Okay. I was really fascinated to, well, thank you for the whole thing, just absolutely brilliant. To hear more about the idea of this kind of vocal imitations of, in these the early recordings you mentioned, of white artists imitating black, or imitating other voices. Are we talking about a kind of vocal blackface going on, or is there something else happening there?
You could certainly look at it in that. I mean, one of the interesting things about recording, of course, is it disembodies the sound, right? And maybe that's different now on YouTube, but that's certainly something working into. But what's interesting in the time is it wasn't really, you didn't worry about having the performer or the composer perform their works, in part because it was such a labor-intensive, individual. You couldn't mass produce copies, so you had to, everything was an original. And so you needed specialized performers who had the time, and the musicians themselves, the people on Broadway, were too expensive to use in that way. But good question. Thank you.
Thank you.